Finishing up with our little RC connector soldering series here. Today we're going to be doing bullets. You're typically going to find bullets on your brushless motors. Sometimes they don't come with them, sometimes you have to solder them on. And same with the ESCs that you hook up to your motor. That's the typical way to connect the motor to the ESC. Some people will even use standalone bullets on their LiPo packs and their input to their ESCs. The one advantage with a standalone bullet is it does take up a little bit less room in space-tight applications, especially with bigger, larger current handling wire and bullet pins. So before we get started on these, as I have stressed many times throughout this soldering series, tinning is of utmost importance. You get that right, you've got it 75-80% beat. Tinning, if you don't know much about it, I've got a separate video just on tinning. I'll link to below in the description and up in the card doodad. So to get started here, again I like using my little vise to hold the pin. So we're going to be doing both. One thing I should mention, I had just brushed on this topic earlier in the tinning section when I talked about if your wire is too thick, as you tin it, it'll puff up a little bit and it may not fit, into your bullet end afterwards. I purposely made this one fairly puffy, and as you see it won't fit. So I'm just going to demo that real quick, how you knock that down. Again, have some protective eyewear on because a little bit of lead and copper shrapnel is going to be coming off of this. I suppose a dust mask if you really want to be careful about it, seeing that it is leaded solder. And I'll just knock this down. By going around it a few times. Actually, let's just zoom in here a bit. So, kind of gives you an idea, and now it will fit into the bullet no problem. As far as exposed length of tinned wire end, bullets are generally pretty shallow, so you don't need much exposed end. Generally just enough to, bottom out in the pin, and maybe have a little bit left over. What is that? Maybe a couple millimeters, 1/8 of an inch, just so you can get your soldering iron tip in there to get the heat migrating from the soldering iron into the end of the bullet. So again, like I did with other connectors, I like plugging one in. You don't have to plug it all the way in, just to hold it. We'll do the female bullet here first. We'll just hold it in. As with some other connectors, kind of like it at a 45-degree angle. That way the solder won't spill out, but if it overflows, there's less of a chance of it, dripping down the side of the pin. Going to be using the little TS100. This is a pretty big wire, it's 10 gauge, pretty big bullet, but I've found that these TS100s are amazing. So what we'll do is we'll fill this partially up with solder, maybe about halfway, half to 3/4 way. Kind of working at a bad angle here. There we go. Put a little more in. And we'll just, I'm going to put a little more in because this wire is not as fat as these bullets. So now I'll just hold. I'm going to put a little solder between the wire and the tip just so I get good heat transfer between the tip and the wire. And we'll just hold that on there. Allow the heat to migrate through the wire and down into the bullet. And I'm not pushing hard on the wire, just moderate pressure, and there it goes. It just, once that liquefies, the wire will just, it'll drop into there. Hold it nice and still as it's cooling. And there's our job. There's some flux on the outside here. We could clean it off with some electrical contact cleaner, isopropanol, or brake clean. I generally don't, because we're going to be covering this with heat shrink, and that little bit of flux will actually help hold that heat shrink onto the pin. Just my little method. So we'll do the other side here real quick. Just mount that in there like that so we can fit the male end in. I'll turn it that way so we can get a better view. Look right down in there this time. Clean our tip off. Fill that right up. Well, don't fill it right up. About halfway, 2/3. Depends how big your wire is. You know, if you've got a really big wire that's going to fill the entire cavity of that pin up, yeah, you're not going to want to fill it up with as much solder because as you put it in, it'll displace a lot of it. And we'll just get some solder on the tip there so we have good heat migration between the tip and the wire. And we'll just hold it while the solder penetrates. I'm holding the tip against the pin as well, so not just the wire but also the bullet pin. And there she goes. Dropped in nicely. And holding it nice and still. And then we'll look at that one too. Hopefully the camera will focus on it. Again, a little bit of flux on the outside. Could clean it off, but again I find that it helps the heat shrink stick. Kind of acts as a little bit of a glue. It's non-corrosive rosin core solder, so we don't have to worry about that. Now we just have to put the heat shrink on. Nice thing about bullet pins is, you know, with connectors you generally have to remember to put the heat shrink on before you actually solder any of the connectors on, because once the connector's on you can't slide the heat shrink past it. With bullets you don't have to worry about that. You know, you can put the heat shrink on if you wanted to before, or you can easily put it on after. I'm just going to get my rework station warming up. Okay, so we're just going to cut the heat shrink. The way this works is on the female end you're going to want this entire length of the pin insulated, and on the male end you just want, you know, it insulated up to where the female end comes to. You could just cut one big piece of heat shrink, put it over the entire assembly when it's plugged in, and then take a razor blade or a hobby knife along the seam. But a lot of times once you heat this over you won't be able to figure out where that seam is. I just like doing them separate, so we'll do the male end first. Trick here is to make sure the heat shrink tube is nice and square. It's not cut at an angle or anything. This is 8mm diameter shrink tube for this 10 gauge wire, but whatever will slide over, and we'll cut about this much here. And we'll just slide it on. You know, get it even with the edge, or if you wanted to, you can plug your pin back in, just so you know where to stop it. And you can use a heat gun here, or a lighter, anything that you normally use to shrink your tube. Okay, so there, that side is done, and now we'll just cut another length here for the female end, long enough to cover the entire pin and a bit of the wire. Try to get it as square as possible. We'll put that on, and we'll just bring it right up to the edge of the other pin shrink tube, and we'll get that on there. Looks good. And there we go. Hope that helped you out how to do a bullet. Nothing really to them. If you can do all the other connectors, which generally have bullets built into them, doing a standalone bullet is generally easier. Cheers, folks. Have a good one.